Very good. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of our seminars in the autumn series from the David Hume Institute. I'll talk a little bit more about this evening's seminar in a moment, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the rest of the series because I think it's particularly strong coming up. On the 20th of this month, we have Professor David Bell, who's been doing a piece of original work for us, a piece of original research commissioned by the David Hume Institute on inequality in Scotland. Inequality was a phrase bandied around in the referendum campaign an awful lot without any definition of what it means, who it affects, how it affects society and the economy, and so on. And we hope that David's work will start to put some dimensions on that issue and also lead on to further work on the policy implications of that. So I think that'll be a very interesting topic. And then later in November, we have work on well-being, which the University's Insight Institute and the Scottish Futures Forum and the Carnegie Trust has been doing, and the implications of that for policy, how we build in measures of well-being into policy. So I think that'll also be a very interesting session. And then we end with our presidential address from Anton Muscatelli, who not only is the principal of the University of Glasgow, but a distinguished economist in his own right. And he's returning to the theme of inequality and putting the work that we do earlier into a national, international context. So I think it's a very strong program, and I hope that you'll all be able to support it. Now, this evening, we are very privileged to have Peter Riddell, the director of the Institute for Government, to speak to us on the first of our series under the umbrella, What Type of Scotland? Now, we all thought the referendum would end the constitutional issue, but it hasn't quite. So Peter's talk this evening on the future relations between Holyrood and Westminster is very relevant for that. I have to say I've known Peter for a very long time. He and I were colleagues on the Financial Times more years ago than either of us care to remember. But he then went on to have a very distinguished career at the Times as political editor, where I think he was for nearly 20 years, before temporarily joining the establishment and becoming a member of the Privy Council, which he was for the special purpose of being part of the investigation into whether the UK was complicit in torture of detainees. But I'm glad to say that he moved out of the establishment, and now he runs the Institute for Government, which I think aims to tell the establishment where it's going wrong and how they can redeem themselves by doing things better. So I look forward to Peter speaking to us this evening. For those of you who don't know the Institute of Government, I do recommend that you look at the website because there are some very, very good things on there, and particularly Governing After the Referendum, a report which Peter's colleague Akash Prone was the lead author on, which gives a number of different scenarios for the future government of the UK, not just Scotland and England, but all the devolved parliaments of the UK and how that might pan out. And that is the precursor for more work that the Institute is doing. And Peter will doubtless tell us something about that. And also, I'm particularly struck by the Programme for Effective Government, where the Institute is saying to the political parties, these are the issues which you really ought to be addressing in your manifestos for the 2015 UK general election. And that is something which I hope the David Hume Institute and its partners will be doing in the context of Scotland and the Scottish elections which are coming up in 2016. Chairing the discussion after Peter's talk tonight, we're very privileged to have Samir Russell, who was a one-time permanent secretary of the Scottish Office and then permanent secretary of the Scottish Executive, and you didn't quite make it to the Scottish Government, Muir, I think, renamed after your time, but also was a principal of Glasgow University after that. And I will keep quiet and sit down and allow Muir to have the discussion. don't go on too long because drinks will be served in the foyer. So as soon as you get thirsty, it's the cue to allow Muir to wind the proceedings up. But anyway, now I'll hand it over to Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Ray. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think I'm still a member of the establishment. I've got to do something pretty bad to have to resign from Privy Council. I think it has to be quite a long prison sentence or the equivalent, or I've got to be seen as committing treason. Also, by chance, the offices above ours at the Institute for Government in Tewcastle Gardens is a Privy Council office, so I haven't escaped the establishment. No, I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I feel daunted in a number of respects, since I'm one of the few people in the room, I imagine, who did not vote, because they did not have a vote on September the 18th. Also, it's a daunting challenge to be invited to address an institute named in honour of David Hume, an intellectual bar which I don't think any of us can attain. I note, however, in all his many writings, David Hume did, in his essay on the idea of a perfect commonwealth, speculate on what the best form of government might be. He hoped that, quote, in some future age, an opportunity might be afforded of reducing the theory to practice, either by a dissolution of some old government or by a combination of men, he clearly didn't foresee the party leaders in Holyrood at present, and the prospective one, to form a new one in some distant part of the world. So he evidently didn't have in mind Scotland for that. He defended a strict separation of powers, decentralisation, extending the franchise to anyone who held property of value, and limiting the power of the clergy. And of course, with Muir here, and also very distinguished people from the Edinburgh University here, I do point out that both universities refused to appoint David Hume to professorships because he was an atheist. In their view, anyway, although he is, of course, buried on Carlton Hill in the old cemetery there. But, you know, I'm sure both Edinburgh and Glasgow universities will live that down over time. My task tonight is more modest, considerably more modest, to offer some reflections on the aftermath of the referendum, which was, after all, only held 20 days ago. I think it seems rather longer for many people in the audience. From someone who works in London, but has strong Anglo-Scottish roots and links. There's a Riddell Close and Court just off the Royal Mile, and today I discovered that actually David Hume lived there for 12 years. I hadn't realised that before. It's now being wonderfully restored some of the rooms there. Also, I walked, for the first time in my life, I walked the battlefield of Culloden 2 months ago. I reflected that my ancestors were on both sides. On my grandmother's side, as a kinsman of the Camerons, reputedly fought and died there, at least that's what my father claimed, for the Jacobite cause. And on my grandfather's side, their sympathies were undoubtedly, as Lowlanders were with King George, even if I doubt if they ventured, they lived near Lillesleaf, they ventured as far north as the Moray Firth. So I've no English anti-Scottish envy. You're not going to hear a UKIP viewpoint this evening, or the similar crudities. Rather, I want to celebrate the assertion of Scottish identity we've seen in politics, literature, and the arts generally over the past 30 years. Now, as Ray pointed out, at present, I'm director of the Institute for Government, a non-partisan think tank whose mission is to improve the effectiveness of government, not just at Westminster, but throughout the UK. And in particular, we've had very close links with both the Scottish and Welsh governments. We've looked at the different ways in which government is run in Edinburgh and Cardiff, notably the unified structure of administration introduced over the past decade here, which I think is a very interesting example, which I think will have influence in Whitehall after the election. We've also launched a major study into future relations between the Westminster government, or perhaps I should say Whitehall government, and the devolved nations and regions. The inquiry, in conjunction with the ESRC Future of the UK and Scotland project, I'm very glad to see Charlie Jeffrey here tonight, has already produced a number of briefing papers, as Ray referred, examining some of the major issues of intergovernmental relations, including some work we did on the distribution of civil servants within the UK, which would have been very pertinent if there had been a yes vote, because there would have been massive problems on that score. The inquiry, headed by my colleague Akash Pawan, is in the third row there, will report around the turn of the year, and he produced a report before the referendum looking at the options and the various no and yes scenarios. But we're going to look at the way intergovernmental relations are developing within the UK. And our view is essentially that at present they're being neglected in London, and the frameworks of intergovernmental relations are actually rather weak. They rely on all too few civil servants. They rely on kind of very formal mechanisms like the Joint Ministerial Council, which actually has very little behind it. I mean, quite often the relevant officials have to invent things to be discussed because the mechanism doesn't bear weight for more controversial items. The administrative links that oil the intergovernmental machine depend on, as I say, very few officials and only the occasional interest of ministers at Westminster. Our provisional view is that new arrangements will have to be devised, whatever form any future devolution proposals take. And our focus in this study is as much on Westminster as it is on Edinburgh and Cardiff. And effectively, it's how you create a quasi-federal structure. And I emphasize the word quasi within the UK. My main argument tonight will be that the outcome of the referendum is in the short term, and in the short term I mean up till May 2015, the UK general election, probably going to be clearer for Scotland than it is for the rest of the United Kingdom. The referendum, or rather the passionate last 10 days, 2 weeks of the campaign, has opened up a debate. And it's created a timetable, which I think beforehand no one would have envisaged at all. Tonight, I'm not going to say much about Wales and Northern Ireland, which are very interesting topics in their own right. Though in Cardiff in particular, events in Scotland have given added weight to the Silk process and to demands for further fiscal devolution, as is being seen in amendments proposed to the Wales Bill, which is now going through the Lords, and there'll be some interesting debates on that next week. And Carwyn Jones, the First Minister, is indeed pressing for an element of looking at the UK as a whole. I think he may overrate which is a parallel argument to Scotland, the willingness of the London politicians to look at the UK as a whole in that respect. I don't believe that what's happened in the last 20 days in Scotland is fully appreciated in London. That's one of the conclusions of being in Scotland in the last few days and my conversations. I think the relief over the result, a clear-cut no, has meant that insufficient attention has been given to the extraordinary aftermath. Despite disappointment, the SNP do not perceive themselves as losers, but have bounced back. Again, I don't think insufficiently appreciated is no political party in Britain has had a trebling of its membership, let alone in 20 days. And the 75, 80,000 or whatever the up-to-date figure is, it may well be above that, is quite an extraordinary phenomenon. When most political parties are losing membership, and it's the implications of that, and of course, in proportionate terms, or not absolute terms, a big rise in Green support, which is an interesting separate issue we might explore. Also, the impact of the prospective change of leadership, with Nicola Sturgeon taking over next month. So, in many ways, the SNP has retained the initiative. Unlike the unionist parties, which particularly the leading unionist party, Labour, is in some disarray. The muttering over the leadership, also the fact that the yes vote was strongest in areas of traditional Labour strength. Glasgow, Dundee, the areas around Glasgow, is of profound political importance. All the early sociological work showing the people who are most economically disadvantaged, the traditional core unskilled working class, the most likely to vote yes, has really, really big implications for Labour. And again, I don't think there's in any way remotely fully understood in London. Here in Edinburgh, all seems, of course, uncertain about where the options are going, as Lord Smith of Kelvin seeks to reconcile differing viewpoints in the next few weeks. I think the Smith process in itself is not sufficiently understood. There is, in a sense, no commission. There's Lord Smith. The people named are actually negotiators. They're not members of a commission. And I don't think that's sufficiently grasped. It's a very important point into what he's trying to do. And I think that's a very important aspect. Also, it's unclear what his role is. He, after all, doesn't have very long to do anything. He's got to produce a report by the end of November. His team will go back to their day jobs at Holyrood, at St Andrew's House, back in London, at the end of November. That doesn't give long at all to reach agreement on heads of principle. Is he supposed to mediate between that? Is he supposed to produce a solution? Will we see, what will we actually see? Because it's going to be extremely difficult to reconcile the different viewpoints. It's a very ambitious timetable, and in one of the most extraordinary phenomena, I think, certainly it was viewed from London as a campaign, it was Gordon Brown's second premiership. It only lasted for 10 days, but the perception in London that actually the three main UK party leaders were irrelevant. They appeared irrelevant even in London, let alone what they appeared in Scotland, and Gordon Brown was setting the terms of the debate and behaving as if he was almost still Prime Minister. When there's a vacuum, people do seize power, and he produced the timetable, had it accepted by the party leaders, and also had an impact within Whitehall by pressing that timetable in the brief second premiership. Now, there are enormous differences between the proposals of the various parties, particularly between the Conservatives and Labour, over the extent of devolution of further tax rating powers. Gordon Brown has not been alone in warning of the implications of further devolution of income tax beyond what is already in the pipeline in the 2012 Act, and it'll be kind of year almost to a day when we, and presumably John Swinney still as Finance Secretary, will be announcing the Scottish rate of income tax. But going much beyond that, there are big implications of that for the position of Scottish MPs at Westminster. And I view, and I'll come and mention this later, that the real issue on the English votes for English laws is about finance measures. A lot of the other things, in theory, could be dealt with, but it's finance which is the core of the arguments. There are also questions on the spending side about how far housing benefit, attendance allowance, and the work programme are going to be devolved. There also may also be questions about creating new partnership arrangements between Edinburgh and Westminster, and I think we'll hear in the Scottish Government's paper on Friday some quite interesting ambitions for trying to affect the outcomes of policy, rather perhaps than some of the details of tax rates. Further devolution of Scotland affects the rest of the UK by limiting the policy options for future national governments. Because it's not just where there's clear-cut devolution, health, education, where there are very big divergences in policy. It's primarily, as I just said, on the issues of fiscal policy. The degree to which control over a large element of tax-raising powers is passed to Holyrood does have big implications for the Treasury. It's not necessarily the amount, because it's still relatively small in relation to the UK as a whole. But of course, in some respects, in some areas, it could well be by introducing competitive tax rates. Many of you will be familiar with the problems in Northern Ireland, where there had been a long-standing, unresolved debate about allowing the Northern Ireland executive control over corporation tax. And the real worries are there. You get into a position of competitive levels of corporation tax, which the Irish government, before its problems with the banking and 2008 and so on, had very low corporation tax rates to attract corporate headquarters to the Republic. Now, some of those issues could arise if you allowed some of those capital taxes to vary within the UK, and the Treasury is naturally cautious on that. That's not necessarily an argument against it, but it does raise issues about a single capital and labour market within the UK, pretty fundamental ones, even leaving aside the present resolved issue of the currency. Similarly, a present housing benefit is being integrated into the new universal credit payment, which is gradually being introduced across the UK. And my view is that whilst it's had a lot of teething problems and a lot of difficulties creating this new credit, it will happen. It may well happen in a different form if, say, there was a Labour government in London next year, but it will happen. But again, that becomes very difficult. The extent to which elements of it, particularly housing and other things, housing benefit and other elements, are devolved to the Scottish Government. It would increase the complexity. And indeed, there's quite interesting arguments there, more fundamental arguments, about the degree to which it's been assumed that devolution means difference. Will that necessarily always follow? It may just be allowing the power to do something. I mean, in a curious way, it rises with income tax, where there are strong reasons against not varying it from the UK level. It's not necessarily true that devolution will mean difference, although it does in a number of policy areas. In some tax areas, it may well not do so. But whatever the differences in party positions now, there are very strong political and electoral pressures for agreement to be reached. None of the three unionist parties wants to be accused of betraying the pre-referendum vow in the Daily Record of their UK leaders to honour the firm timetable proposed by Gordon Brown. However, one could see the electoral threat absolutely exposed by the post-referendum polls, which show particularly the danger to Labour, and indeed the language used by Nicola Sturgeon in staking her position to take over from Alex Salmond as SNP leader and First Minister. They indicate the type of campaign that could be waged next spring. But Labour nationally, of course, is in no position to lose any one of its 41 MPs from Scotland, particularly in what could well be an extremely tight election. For different reasons, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats don't want to be accused of reneging on the pledge to devolve more tax powers and some element of spending over welfare. So they don't want to do it. Equally, it's in the Tories' interest to expose Labour. I mean, indeed, one may well see that in some respects the negotiations, an affinity between David Cameron and Nicola Sturgeon on issues. They have a joint interest against Labour on this. But it won't be easy to produce an agreed package by the end of January, when we're supposed to see the draft clauses. It's open to question whether Lord Smith, by the end of November, and that is not a long time, may be able to set out heads of agreement. Will he be able to do that, even in the broad sense? Because even at present, all right, we've got the Scottish Government's plan on Friday, the unionist parties have been given the scope to revise and look at the proposals they made in the 6 months leading up to the referendum vote. So it's a hell of an ask to believe that Lord Smith can resolve that. He's got a reputation as someone who can bang heads together, but the only trouble is it's not perhaps as an industrial dispute 2 heads. You've got at least 4, if not 5 heads, which have to be banged together. And I don't want to quite take this metaphor too far because it gets a bit grotesque. But the difficulty, I think, is absolutely clear. It may just be that all he can do is set out a kind of list of options at that stage, and then it's back to the politicians. Now, the unionist parties certainly have a real electoral imperative to try and themselves reach an agreed position on draft clauses by the end of January. What happens then, one imagines there'll be debate at Westminster. The interesting question is also the degree to which it triggers processes at Holyrood, and I think there's a degree of uncertainty on that, partly dependent on the key question of what the response of the Scottish Government is to that. In many respects, there's no particular incentive for Nicola Sturgeon as new First Minister to reach an agreement ahead of the UK general election, because after all, for her, the most important election is a year later, in May 2016. Indeed, if she can use the leverage of saying we want more SNP MPs, given the low base of the 2010 UK general election for the SNP, that would be very interesting. So, and I don't think that there's an enormous expectation that the Scottish Government and the SNP will have signed up to a package necessarily before the UK general election, again, for electoral reasons. There are complexities there. I think the big factor, which I think is insufficiently appreciated so far anyway, within Whitehall, Westminster hasn't really thought about it because the House of Commons has been in recess since the referendum, but certainly in Whitehall is the difficulty of the unionist parties reaching agreement and the degree to which, although I think the scales will have lifted from that the Scottish Government will be putting quite a demanding proposals on Friday. I think they're probably now clear on that, but they're certainly not clear on how difficult it will be for Labour to sign on. And again, that's work in progress there. I think the interesting thing also from the SNP point of view is what impact a trebling of membership has. And what type of party is it? One imagines most of them are probably left-leaning, maybe ex-Labour. Well, what impact does that have on the demands and tactics of the Scottish Government? We're in completely uncharted territories there. There's also the very interesting issue of the legislative consent procedures. That they were, after a lot of argument, resolved over the post-Calman process and 2012 Act. They didn't come into create any problems over the referendum because there was the Edinburgh Agreement. Both governments agreed on it, and therefore legislative consent procedures were used happily. But what would happen if there was an agreed unionist position by whatever government there is in London after May, but the Scottish Government didn't agree? I mean, legally, these are procedures, they're not statutory. But in practice, would it be conceivable that a UK government could pass proposals that were unacceptable to a Scottish government? Very interesting debate. I mean, that would trigger lots of both political and constitutional problems. Now, to English Tories and to UKIP, all talk of a package of more measures amounts to more handouts to the Scots. I don't agree. I think that the Scots should be wary, indeed be careful of what they wish for. Increased fiscal responsibility is what it says, more responsibility. If you increase the proportion of devolved spending which is raised in taxes decided upon by the Scottish Parliament, and that's the crucial phrase, not raised in Scotland, because go from Scotland to HMRC and come back in a grant, that's very different, but actually determined by the Scottish Parliament, that puts pressure on Holyrood. It puts considerable pressure on it. I'm very marked in my views by having worked for 3 years in the United States, where there is proper fiscal devolution down to the level of the city. I paid 10% of my income tax to the District of Columbia when I worked there. And it was a kind of Boston Tea Party thing in reverse. I didn't have a vote, but by heavens, I cared about how the money was being spent. 10% of income directly fixed and raised by that authority. And I think that the more high the proportion of taxes decided upon by Holyrood will have direct political implications. And because I think there's a confusion often between powers and money, that granting more money is how some things are seen. But if you actually give more power, it changes the equation. The closer alignment of spending and taxes, as happens in federal systems and where there is financially responsible local government, as I said in the US, means that politicians in devolved bodies and localities take more responsibility and have much tighter options. Of course, most systems retain a national redistributive mechanism. And the party leaders have all committed themselves to retaining the much vilified and misunderstood barley allocation or formula. It's actually, I think, quite an elastic concept. It's unclear what this will mean in practice, not least since there is certain to be a further tight squeeze on relevant English domestic programmes on which the formula is based in the next Parliament. So I think the fiscal options could be very tight for any government formed after May 2016 at Holyrood. So far from the Scots benefiting, my hunch is the combination of further devolution under the mantra of fiscal responsibility and a tight national spending review next year could well mean more pain and some very awkward tax and spending decisions for the new Scottish Government. Now, if the outlines of a deal for Scotland can be seen through the autumn mists, the future is even less clear on other issues. There are no common or urgent political and economic interests on matters affecting England and the Westminster Parliament, despite the 7 a.m. response of David Cameron on September the 19th. The English question is hard to define, let alone to answer, and it exists on two levels. First, an alleged sense of unfairness, that the Scots, and to a lesser extent the Welsh and the Northern Irish, are receiving favourable treatment, which is set to become even more favourable. Second, that England is too centralised, and the parts of England are as large as Scotland and larger than Wales, only sometimes defined as coherent regions, do not have sufficient powers to run their own affairs. And not far in the background is the general anti-politician, or rather anti-Westminster mood, a sense of grievance against those supposedly in a privileged position. This mood clearly helped the Yes campaign in the Scottish referendum, and has fuelled the success in very different ways of the UK Independence Party, as we'll no doubt see in Clacton tomorrow, and much less remarked of the Greens, whose percentage in the polls is crept up and could well have an influence on Liberals and Labour. There are no straightforward answers in England. English regionalism has not recovered from the crushing defeat of the proposal for a North East Regional Assembly 10 years ago. There have been stirrings of support for granting more powers to city regions based on the success of Manchester in coordinating transport and promoting economic growth. But it's interesting, everyone talks about Manchester, but there remain enormous problems in other English cities. I was in Birmingham last week, briefly, at the Tory conference where the Institute for Government had a fringe meeting. Birmingham is lagging well behind and has real difficulties in creating the relationships which Manchester has successfully done. And the other problem, of course, with this is you can talk about the city regions, but what about rural areas and smaller towns? But there's no agreed plan, whether it goes beyond centralising some spending budgets to allow such cities to raise more money from themselves. Moreover, as I say, it's a very partial solution. The one certainty is that the pattern of devolution and decentralisation will be uneven and asymmetrical. That still leaves the problem for Westminster of the position of MPs representing nations and regions with widely different levels of fiscal devolution, truly the West Lothian question, whereby Scottish members of the House of Commons can vote on domestic policy issues affecting English, such as health and education, but cannot do so on matters affecting their own constituents. The rather blasé response, which was certainly often heard with a Scottish accent in the immediate post-devolution years after 99, was to say it's a pointless, unanswerable question and seek to move on. That was the years of very big Labour majorities, when in a sense it was a pointless question. I don't think this reaction is any longer persuasive, especially if more fiscal powers are devolved. The question is undoubtedly tricky and risks increasing the divisions between Scottish and other MPs, rather than binding the union ever closer together. I mean, you may produce a solution which actually pushes the union apart rather than brings it together. There are considerable procedural problems in defining English-only legislation, since many measures, especially of a fiscal character, have knock-on effects for the whole of the UK, in which Scottish MPs have a legitimate interest. And there are risks of creating two majorities, one for UK-wide measures and another for English ones. The proposal favoured by some Conservative MPs for an English Parliament looks completely unwieldy, given the relative size of England, about 85% of the whole UK, if it means a separately elected group of MPs and by implication separate English ministers. Even the idea that you have 2 days in English Parliament and 3 days of a Westminster one, but having the same people, is still pretty unwieldy, because it also in practice means different types of minister. Whilst there is an interesting debate about whether a Scottish MP can any longer be health secretary, as for example John Reid was, post-1999, I query whether that's any longer possible. Well, obviously it's constitutionally doable, and similarly would apply in education or DCLG, that whether you could have, and in fact I think it's a very long time since there was any Scottish or Welsh MPs who were held posts, certainly in the Department of Communities and Local Government and in education. I think that would be very difficult indeed in practice. Parallels have been drawn with the unhappy period in the early 1990s when Boris Yeltsin was Prime Minister of Russia and Mikhail Gorbachev was in charge of the disintegrating Soviet Union. This, as we all know, didn't last long, and I don't think we want to go down that route. What has become known as English votes for English laws was examined by an authorities commission under Sir William Mackay, a former Commons clerk, which was set up by the coalition government. And people forget it was set up to honour a pledge made by the Conservatives and opposition. And it was one, I think it was about 20 or 30 commissions where there wasn't agreement within the coalition, so they set up a commission to do it. One also tried to sort out about the Human Rights Act, which the Mackay Commission actually did produce an agreed solution, or agreed range of options, was a success, while some of the other commissions, like the Human Rights one, completely failed. And it reported in March 2013. The Mackay Commission outlined various options, and at a minimum this could amount to a quasi-veto by English MPs on distinctively English measures, while preserving a UK-wide say at the second and third reading of bills. So English MPs would have their say in the kind of committee stage, and it would be, you'd increase the bar on using Scottish and Welsh votes to override an English opinion, would effectively be it. Moreover, even before contemplating such a solution, it's necessary to be clear on what's going to be devolved and what's still reserved as UK-wide powers, and what is really distinctly English. In practice, and that particularly applies, of course, as I've said before, the problem on budget and financial measures, which is the heart of the debate, really. In practice, most post-war governments, including Labour ones, have had majorities in England. I mean, it's one of the great myths of the argument about the English votes for English laws that it is a problem. It's only been a problem, in theory, in a tiny number of cases. The 274 elections and a very few other elections. Because in general, when you've had a Labour or Tory government, they've had clear-cut majorities. For all the Blair years, Labour had a majority in England. It wasn't a problem. It would have made a difference between a minority government and a majority government at the last general election. The Tories, if you'd taken out Scotland out of the equation, Tories, because David Mundell would no doubt be a big loss to the Tory majority, but not numerically. And that would have made a difference with a majority, so you wouldn't have had a coalition. Quite an interesting aspect of it. But in general, it's the exception, not the rule. And the point that the argument is, I think in many respects, exaggerated. Hence, while the Conservatives are naturally keen to push some variant of English votes for English laws, Labour is very hostile, seeing a threat to its political position. The Liberal Democrats have been saying this week they recognise the problem, but are cautious about endorsing the solution. There's absolutely no likelihood of any agreement before the May 2015 general election on this issue. And indeed, when it was floated by David Cameron in the immediate aftermath of the referendum result, it was as much aimed at UKIP and Labour as it was to have any relevance here. In particular, aimed at UKIP. It was very clear how Nigel Farage was going to play it. He was going to be the English nationalist, and UKIP, amongst other things, apart from being a protectionist party, is also a very strongly English nationalist party. But Cameron was trying to prevent that ground being taken from him in that respect. And despite some confused initial signals, there should be no pre-election link between agreeing or between any package of further fiscal devolution for Scotland and a plan for Scottish MPs at Westminster. I mean, there will be no link of that. The Tories will say this will be the consequence, but there will be no link in terms of the package at all, because it is being used much more as a campaigning tool. It may, however, if we had a Conservative government in Westminster after the election, they would undoubtedly press for procedural changes along these lines to go in parallel with the legislation on the extended devolution to Scotland. But of course, in these circumstances, if you did have a Conservative government at Westminster, the proposal would be irrelevant. Since any Conservative government, even if the Tories gain a few seats north of the border, it won't be enough to make a difference. Labour has argued that these issues should not be rushed, but should be the subject of a constitutional convention in autumn 2015. This is a way, perfectly understandably, from the Labour point of view, of pushing it into touch. It's far from clear what will be on the agenda of such a convention. Just relations between the component nations and regions of the UK? Just that? Or should it also include relations with the European Union? This is the first time I mention Europe. It's very difficult normally to do any lecture on British politics without mentioning Europe far earlier than that. And remember, a Conservative government has promised a referendum on the issue, and various ambiguous things have been said in Glasgow by the Liberal Dems on that this week. What their conditions for a coalition would be on that. Would it also include reform of the House of Lords, one of the great unfinished bits of business? And how should such a commission be constituted? There are a number of precedents from the unofficial Scottish Convention of the 1990s to a more formal government initiatives in, for example, Australia, over the question of retaining the monarchy, and most recently the Convention in Ireland on changes to its constitution. The latter, well, in fact, both Australia and Ireland, combined representatives of the main parties, together with randomly chosen members of the public. The idea, however, of a completely politician-free convention, a kind of citizens' assembly, may appeal to some in the anti-politician mood as a kind of pure initiative. But it's highly unlikely to be effective, and it's rather unrealistic, since, after all, it's going to be the politicians who will deal with the product of any commission. A very interesting example for that, for the real specialists in this area, British Columbia had a citizens' assembly, deliberative assembly, on electoral reform. By chance, my wife's cousin was one of the people on it, my only footnote in constitutional history, as we discovered when she and her husband were visiting us. And it was an absolutely fascinating process, because they met every 2 weeks in Vancouver to discuss options and to hear from the experts on electoral reform. She was one of the most best-informed people on electoral systems. And boy, she must have bored the people in her village on it, because she became very enthusiastic on it. The commission produced an option for a convention. The politicians rejected it, and it was twice rejected in a referendum in British Columbia. The result is, this extremely intelligent lady is very disillusioned with the political process. So be very careful when thinking of constitutional conventions. There's some quite awkward issues on that. With no prospect of a resolution of most of these questions before the general election, there's certainly to be pulled into the campaign itself, in very different ways, north and south of the border. I can see the campaign in Scotland being wholly different from the campaign in England. I mean, it won't quite be like Northern Ireland politics, because after all, the MPs returned can form a government, obviously the Labour MPs would, and someone can form a government. But it will be more akin to a different political process, like we see in Northern Ireland, than we've seen before at a UK general election, because the SNP, I'm sure, will be playing the line of we need more people to secure a proper deal from any future government. And indeed, I mean, it's not inconceivable, or I'm sure it would not be a happy thought, either the Tories or Labour, that if you got a contingent in double figures, in the teens of SNP MPs, they could be the swing support. That produces a number of, just as, of course, the Irish nationalists were at various stages in the 1880s to the 1910s. If you look at what happened in the two 1910 elections, it was the Irish nationalist MPs and the promise of an Irish Home Rule Bill which sustained the government of Asquith over the period, because the Liberals and Tories, or the Unionists as they were then, had virtually the same number of MPs. And now the numbers will be different. There won't be so many as the 70 or 80 MPs from Ireland as applied then, but don't forget that's a possibility. The SNP will argue for larger representation at Westminster to safeguard and ensure greater devolution, while the Conservatives will play the English card against Labour and head off the challenge of UKIP. So the overall governance of the UK and the relations of the nations and regions will probably remain both murky and unstable. Now, anyone arguing that such constitutional matters should be above politics is, I'm afraid, being a bit naive and unhistorical. They've always been at the heart of the debate of political and party advantage. Constitutional change has always been about advantage in that way, as indeed David Hume himself showed in his History of England. Thank you very much.
Well, Peter, thanks for that. Is this microphone working? Can anybody hear me? A tour d'horizon and a tour de force. We've got 40 minutes-ish at the outside for questions and discussion and comment. And can I ask you to put your hands up? We have a couple of microphones here. This is subject to Chatham House rule. Say who you are, say where you're from, and we promise you won't be quoted. So who would like to go first? Tom, you go first. The microphone's coming down.
Thank you very much. Tom Ward, thank you for that fascinating talk. Presumably one of the purposes of devolution is to enable different policies on devolved matters to be pursued in different nations of the UK, presumably because they may better suit their local conditions. One of the things I find slightly depressing, though, is how little serious academic research and how little serious political discussion there is about whether these differing policies actually do achieve better results in practice. Because now, having had 15 years of different policies, perhaps on health and education in Scotland from England, there is a mass of information which could be analysed, from which you could draw conclusions. I see very little serious debate about this. Do you agree with me? Do you think there's any prospect for this getting better, so we can find out if these devolved policies are benefiting citizens?
Perhaps just a brief answer on that.
Yeah,
and
very,
get some people
very
in
brief
here
on that.
to
I think
comment on it.
Yeah, there is more work being done, I think you would say. But funnily enough, this is the second time in a week. We had an event at the Institute for Government last week where someone asked the identical question. It's very interesting that they asked the absolutely identical question. And I think, therefore, that rather suggests that more needs to be done on that. But I think there is now evidence, both, health and education particularly, quite a lot of evidence. But there has some work is being done under the auspices of some devolution studies on this. And, of course, your underlying point, Tony Blair never really accepted the logic of devolution at all. And he was horrified on tuition fees, as we know. He didn't think it would result in difference until he then started attacking the Labour Welsh administration for its health outcomes.
Now, before we go on to a different subject, are there people who can speak up for what the academic community is doing and the conclusions they might have drawn on Tom's point? I'm trying to be constructive here. The academics in the audience. Gentleman there. Microphone for you.
I'm very intrigued to follow up on Tom's question. We've got a very experienced person looking to do a PhD on this subject at the moment, and we're thinking, surely there is work that could be done objectively. I'm thinking, for example, on foreign direct investment. We've seen most amazing sort of switches during the referendum in terms of the attitude to foreign direct investment, but that, for example, is one thing that could be clarified by saying if we're going to have semi-Devo max all the way around the UK, how do those guys play it to make sure that they get more than their fair share of good foreign direct investment, armed with more powers? And how do we ensure that at the end of the day we don't all just shoot each other in the foot by trying to compete against each other? So I also would be very interested to know whether you feel there's work already being done that we could follow up on.
It may be we've identified a topic, Ray, for a future David Hume investigation. Unless anybody wants to come back on that, I think Andy Milne of Surf had something to say. Microphone here, please.
Thank you very much. Fascinating stuff, or fascinating times, particularly here in Scotland. My own organisation is concerned with regeneration, community regeneration, and one of the things that we've been debating around the referendum is greater capacity for community empowerment. The Scottish Government's putting through a community empowerment bill at the moment. And I was really interested in your references there to Tony Blair. I think I'm right in saying that as Tony Blair went through 3 successful elections, each time the level of vote that he received dropped. I think in the last time, it was about 23%, and that represented, rather than his personal unpopularity, though there may have been some of that, a general trend downwards in terms of the level of support for political parties. I think we may have seen that reflected quite strongly in the referendum here, particularly around the Yes campaign, which had Christians, lawyers, artists, women, LGBT, all for yes, rather than through political parties. And I'm glad of the Chatham House rule, because my suspicion is that the tripling, not just of the SNP membership, but also Greens and, in fact, the Scottish Socialist Party, perhaps with the latter two, but I think it's more of a problem for the SNP, which may have difficulty in accommodating the energy and aspirations of those individuals who may relatively quickly come to realise that their aspirations might not be delivered well through conventional political parties. So my question is then, if the trajectory of continuing disengagement from mainstream political parties, and yet a very strong appetite for engagement persists through individual online communications, through Wings for Scotland, Bella Caledonia, etc., what are the implications then for effective government?
Really interesting question there. How do you avoid disappointment and disillusionment? I think it's very difficult. that what I've been outlining is fairly conventional politics coming into place, the politics of advantage, of people looking at how they maximise their MPs at Westminster next time and all that. And I think your point on the longer-term results of the tripling of SNP membership, I mean, one, it was quite interesting to see how it's reflected in policy making ahead of 2016. But also, when people discover they can't have it all now, and there was a conflict between pragmatic leadership and people wanting the absolutes. And I think there are really big issues on that. I think how it's more generally reflected, I think it comes more to the forms of government at local level, governance at local level. I think the answers, and I don't know the details of the bill now going through Holyrood, but some of the answers lie with greater genuine local empowerment on things. And I think that's the answer, because a national political process is bound to involve the elites, and you can't have mass participation all the time. And I think but so I think it's a more local level.
Name, please, for the last question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Andy Milne from Star. Thank you.
That stands for Urban Regeneration Forum, I think. Is that right? Other comments or questions? Lady at the back. Right at the back.
Hi, Nicola McKeown, University of Edinburgh. Very enjoyable talk, Peter, thank you. I was curious about the distinction you made between power, I think, and money.
Yeah.
I would also be inclined to make a distinction between power and responsibility. And it seems to me that some of the powers that are coming from Scotland 2012 lean more towards the responsibility than the power. And it's possible that what emerges from the Smith process will provide much more power on fiscal arrangements over thresholds, tax rates, and so on. My question is it conceivable that with that degree of power over taxation that the administration could continue to be through HMRC, or would that degree of autonomy imply also a distinctive administration and delivery?
Well, before I answer your question, I think what the point I was trying to make next was that there is too much of a view in England that assuming that giving more power is just about money, rather than actually you're giving responsibility, you're giving accountability for decision making. That's the point I was making there. That the assumption was, okay, we make the Scots responsible for X% of income tax. That's giving them money, but it isn't actually giving money. That's the point I was making there. On your administrative point, the interesting thing is so far, from what I gather, all right, there's Revenue Scotland, and no doubt hear tomorrow from John Swinney in the budget, because it's the first time he'll be doing the stamp duty and landfill tax and how that works. But between taxes which are genuinely local, and it makes entire sense to have a local administrative machinery for it. And I think this was one of the dilemmas in the Yes campaign and some of the problems there, when because of mobility of people, you would want to retain HMRC, because the complexities of moving, I mean, exactly the same is true on work and pensions, on the pension side of that to move away from HMRC it would just be so expensive for Scotland that it's much more sensible to have what is, I'm told, is rather a good working relationship with the HMRC in London on those aspects which are cross-border. It's very different once talking about taxation, which is property taxation, which is localised. Which you can administer locally, and indeed the people who administer have to be local, because that's where the charge is incurred. It is much more difficult when you're talking about people moving around much more. And in fact, the interesting question would have been, even if it had been a yes vote, how many shared services in practice would have been retained, because it would have made no sense not to have a shared service. So I think that's where I think we'll see distinctions emerging, genuinely local areas, and things like pensions and income tax, national insurance is another interesting thing, where actually it makes far more sense to have a UK-wide basis of doing it.
Comment there.
Scott Bedard. I was actually once a student of Nicholas and now back at the University of Edinburgh. I had a question about any aspirations, Scottish aspirations for a future role in supranational or further role in supranational or international affairs. You see subnational trade offices opening all the time in other capitals, and I wonder whether you sense from the spirit that you've seen that there's an interest in increasing that representation as part of this sort of Devo Max agenda.
Well, a lot of it's been happening anyway. I mean, there's been, I wouldn't say a Scottish foreign policy, but certainly a Scottish representation. And there are interesting issues there which have applied in other countries where an important constituent part with considerable devolved powers has been able to exert a particular international voice, partly in areas where it's got particular interests. I mean, energy. I mean, the same would have applied in the transitions Muir had from the old administrative devolution to post 99. Even before 99, there was a distinctive Scottish voice. Obviously, we know on forestry and fisheries, but also on energy. That will carry on, but I think it will become more so, but within obviously a context. And in States, the Foreign Office is quite sensitive to that because it's used to operating with federal countries where the constituent parts do have a voice and quite a significant influence.
I think it would be fair to say that in '99 the Foreign Office did pick that up. They rolled the pitch a lot with Brussels and with the various federal entities around Europe, and we were very much welcomed into a world in which we were playing a part along with various parts of Germany and so on. So there's something there. Whether it builds, how it builds is an interesting question. While we're on the area, I mean, any more comments and observations on the Devo Max point? I mean, the point about responsibility was based on tax, but there must be more questions about how realistic the Devo Max options are and where they take us. So if I can kind of corral that a wee bit. Peter, you go first.
It's Peter Reiki from the Young Academy of Scotland. I hope it's a closely enough related point. The currency debate was obviously massive in the independence discussions. You've mentioned it once in your talk this evening. You've also mentioned some of the points on devolution that were considered to be a red line in the currency debate. For example, corporation tax, which we know the discussion is ongoing in Northern Ireland. Do you think that even in the Devo Max debate, some of that will either give the lie to or be constrained by the currency points that were discussed earlier this year?
Well, obviously they're going to be slightly different because the currency issue doesn't arise. But some of the issues of a single monetary union, or single currency union, which we have and will continue to have for a considerable time, at least that was determined on September the 18th, do apply to what I'd put as a parallel point, which is a single capital, labour and product market. And I think the constraints are on measures of devolution which would be seen as disturbing the single capital, labour and product market. And that's where the issue is. And now obviously corporation tax is the most significant there, where you would not be talking about a level UK playing field on citing of companies and so on and so forth. And I think that's where it is. It doesn't apply, and that's why the more interesting tax options are those which genuinely where the liability arises within Scotland. And that's where there's more scope. But of course, there's less money there too. The same also apply on VAT. I mean, there are EU constraints on altering VAT, quite significant ones. But there would be, I don't think, a desire to create across the Tweed massive hypermarkets with people going for different tax rates. Well, of course, that does happen in the United States. I lived, as I mentioned earlier, in the District of Columbia, which had different sales taxes from Virginia, which are on the same metro system. And in theory, you had to declare in your tax form if you bought certain goods in Virginia. Of course, no one did. I mean, it was completely unenforceable. But because there were differences in sales tax, and therefore there were enormous supermarkets and hypermarkets literally over the bridge where General Lee had his house, I mean, reliving the American Civil War, just over the bridge, over the Potomac, which did create those problems. But I think that's a cautionary tale.
Comes down to tank's full of petrol, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we have a point there. Chat
Yes,
the microphone.
Andrew Milligan from Standard Life Investments, absolutely picking up the previous speaker's point and elaborating a little on what you're saying. I remember, but not in sufficient detail, Carney's excellent speech in January on how a currency union works. Yeah. And I have a figure in my mind that the fiscal transfers across the country means that at least 50% of the taxation and spending, et cetera, has got to be controlled by the central government. It's only up to 50% you can devolve, so to speak. Now, that speech, I need to read it again, but I would encourage everyone to do so because it very neatly set out, if you want a currency union to work, these are the requirements. And to a certain extent, the no vote was a vote for a currency union to continue. And the Devo discussions, therefore, are how far can we go along the lines Carney has suggested to make devolution work within a currency union?
Yeah, I don't think I can add anything to your point.
Yeah.
And I thought that's where, in a sense, I mean, it's a perverse way of putting it, but actually there were some very interesting issues which were teased out of the referendum debate. I mean, not everyone would accept the way they're presented, but some of the implications of operating a single market, I think, were teased out very interestingly and are directly relevant to what the potential, what you can do now realistically without getting into all kinds of problems.
Okay, voice in here.
Paul Brewer from PwC. Looking at the spectrum of issues that could be examined under Devo Max and the fact that the Smith Commission's boundaries are going to be set by the political parties and they have to reach some sort of consensus. And picking up on Nicola McEwen's point, what is the risk where you have a process which is designed to reach a very quick resolution to political aspirations and the aspirations of all those individuals who've become more politically aware and active, not meeting the practical requirements of workable solutions? So if we're having a very fast Smith Commission process, what is the risk that we end up with things that HMRC couldn't implement or which have very high cost and have to be unpicked and reviewed again after the Commission has actually reached its conclusions?
Well, remember the UK government are also a party to the process too. And I dare say, going back to the last question, there's some rather bright people in the Treasury who are alert to that. When you talk about the speed of the process, yes, it is speedy. I think it's speedy in identifying options and narrowing options, more than necessarily producing. I think we will see draft clauses, if not necessarily to celebrate Burns Night with, but shortly afterwards. I'm sure we will see draft clauses, and I emphasize the draft point, because there is some way to go between that and legislation. There'll be actually, whilst there is the timetable is tight for reaching agreement, I think what will happen is the debate will be narrowed in that period, but there will certainly be time before the final legislation. I mean, it's pushing it to see legislation on the statute book before the Holyrood elections in May 2016. It's pushing it to do that. It's possible if the political will is there, but that's quite a long time. I mean, I think you're right to identify the dangers, but in practice, the timetable may be less of a constraint than you say.
Okay. Thank you there.
Nasra Bradley from University Glasgow. I have a question about the devolution process in the sense that the commonality between the three unionist parties' positions, if you see, is there's quite a low common denominator to it. And what you actually, if you were to contrast that with what is actually required to make a quasi-devolution or quasi-federal state run, what would you see are the differences or the gaps between what do you think could be offered and what you think should be there? Because there are local issues that are very different for Scotland now, which would be different to the capital or labour market requirements in, for example, the rest of UK. So in order to bridge the gap, what do you think should be there and what do you think would really be offered?
That's a nice simple
one, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, nice simple one. And I'm not. All I can say is that's Lord Smith's job, not mine. On that, I mean, I think that goes back. Actually, it follows on from the previous question. That I think a lot of the task of the next few weeks will be defining precisely those questions. That between, in a sense, what is a rather mechanistic suggestions on X% of income tax and so on, and then looking at what let's use the term home rule government would do to be effective. And I think some of the debate will be about bridging those differences, but within a context of a very integrated UK-wide economy. I think that's a constraint. The constraint is with maximum movement of labour, the 800,000 Scots living in England and so on and so forth, which is the point made on the franchise. But more generally, with the movements of labour there are, and of capital and so on, without imperiling those, which are a threat to Scotland. And I think that actually where the interesting debate will be, rather than as much as, rather, some of the technicalities of whether you take housing benefit out or whatever. I think it's actually a bigger picture. And I think that's where perhaps there is a danger of rushing. But I'm feeling a bit more positive about that, actually.
Glad someone in the room is. Lady with the microphone there.
Hi, Jenny Stewart from KPMG. Two-part question. We've talked a lot around the tax side, but just picking up on the power side and devolving further powers. So just whether you had any reflections on that. So for example, NHS, most of that is devolved at the moment to Scotland, but there are elements that aren't. There are other areas like broadcasting and so on. So just any thoughts you had on powers. And then picking up what you were saying earlier around VAT, clearly there are certain taxes that can't, or that would be very difficult to devolve, but do you foresee a situation where some of the revenue would be ascribed to the Scottish Government, so some through the funding formula, that then, adding to your responsibility point, would then increase the responsibility that the Scottish Government might have around some of those areas? So interested in your thoughts on those 2 points.
Well, on the latter, you don't actually, if you say you can't alter VAT, but you just get a certain percentage of it, you don't necessarily achieve very much. Partly, do you say the VAT arising in Scotland? I mean, after all, the pattern of spending in Scotland is not the same as in England and Wales. You get into a whole host of problems. It doesn't actually achieve your responsibility point, which is you're the guys deciding on the tax take. On your first point, yeah, sure, Muir knows 100 times more than I do on what were put into the devolved package and what were reserved, and there were fuzzy areas. Everyone knows there are, and they've emerged more fuzzy areas, particularly on welfare spending and so on. The other thing I say, the interaction, particularly, and this applies in Wales more because they're not so far down the road, between aspects of local government activity and welfare budgets. And I was talking to some Welsh officials, and they say one of the problems with some of the national work and pension reforms, universal credit and other things, they actually have the effect of shifting responsibility to local authorities in practice. That, of course, is in relation to a devolved budget. So there are lots of fuzzy areas which can be looked at. And when I say fuzzy areas, I'm not trying to belittle them. I think they're very important. And there are obviously elements of what happened in 1999 which can be re-examined. In many cases, there were good reasons for doing it. I mean, there's some very interesting ones from university people here, is research councils being a reserve power. Now, you can get into a quite interesting debate on the degree to which that should be altered. And I think you probably find a division between the arts and humanities and the physical scientists on that. But some quite big issues, which are where reasonable people can disagree.
And very hard to see how Smith can fix that in 2 or 3 weeks, given the time we took and the answers we didn't get. Des
McNulty, University of Glasgow. In your talk, you made reference to the extraordinary sight of Gordon Brown taking centre stage when the 3 leaders of the unionist parties kind of retreated and let him apparently take command. Apart from the timetable and in some sense saying things more loudly than others perhaps had, was there anything additional distinctive in what Gordon Brown was saying in the last 2 weeks that you think is worthy of further comment? I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the emphasis he gave to pooling and sharing, and also his apparent embracing of some form at least of federalism, which he always historically opposed. And do you think that has a wider influence in what might go forward?
I think, I mean, it is very unclear about his continuing influence on that. That whether it's thank you, Gordon, for helping save the Union, and thank you, and no longer. I mean, I'm not clear, and I'm not sure other people are, where his voice is being heard now, how it's being expressed. I mean, you know, all kinds. I mean, there are Scottish issues about relationships with his former colleagues in Scotland, which I don't need to go into, and as well as with the party in London, where he is the, has been, the dominant figure. I mean, if you think of the Labour leader and the Shadow Chancellor, both of whom are special advisors, it doesn't make for easy relationships, very obviously. On your substantive points, I think the sharing point is a more interesting one. I think one of the, I mean, it goes back actually to some of the things, questions made about tax. I think one of the, and I'll refer to what Muir said at least twice already. You can't do this in 2 or 3 weeks. And nor does it necessarily have to be done in 2 or 3 weeks. But I think one of the interesting questions, and I didn't mention it, and I should have done, is from a London perspective, there was and it's a product of devolution, there's been a tendency on many areas to say, well, the Scots can carry on, do their own thing with it. We're not interested, even where it is a reserved power, not a devolved power. There is no Scottish perspective on some, say, Home Office issues and some other departments, work and pensions possibly. I mean, it's the English elephant. And I think the interesting question there is whether, and there is a consciousness, certainly at the civil service level, I'm not sure how much at the ministerial level, of a need to revive the meaning of the union. The same, because we've had the no vote, that's actually got to mean something. There's got to be, that London departments have got to accept that Scotland is part of the union on reserved matters. And that means thinking of, as say, immigration policy is a classic example of that. Some other aspects of non-devolved criminal justice. I mean, I know most of it's devolved from historical and long-term reasons, but there are some aspects of home affairs policy. And I think that, therefore, sharing is a very interesting area, and I think one where we may see more debate. It doesn't have to be tied up in legislation, because a lot of it's just cooperative. It's just actually taking account of a viewpoint. And I say, the government in London not regarding Scotland as another, which it has traditionally been. And what was interesting is if you look at the input from Whitehall departments into the referendum debate, it was terribly patchy. Some department just didn't play any part at all. I mean, we talked to the people involved in the coordinating. The Treasury played a massive part for all the reasons we've talked about. A lot of other departments didn't. So I think the sharing thing is interesting. On federal, and this comes back to Constitutional Convention, lots of other things, it's going to be a real mess, bound to because of England. I mean, there may well be, I mean, this is where Carwyn Jones is pushing for a more federal structure, accepting, but the latest figures for Welsh independence, I think, was down to 3%. And the Plaid are on the defensive on that. So that clearly is not part of the Welsh debate. The Welsh debate is much more towards what you can create as a federal structure. I don't hear much response from London for that. What I do think there's a real need for goes back to the project which the IFG is doing, which is how do you strengthen intergovernmental relations? How do you make more, because I think they're present, that they're rather weak.
Microphone at the back.
Richard Curley, Queen Margaret University.
Yeah, please.
Could I take you back, Peter, to your, I thought, rather sanguine view that devolution need not mean difference? I would have suggested there are two forces that make for difference. One is the view of potential beneficiaries or those affected by any change in policy, and the other is the driver for those who are seeking to be elected. People tend not to seek to be elected saying everything's hunky-dory and we're not going to change what's there at the moment. And those who might see a benefit in a change will usually press for something which they can define in some way or describe in some way as being better than the experience elsewhere. Although, as we saw last week in the writing off of community charge poll tax debt proposition, our arrangements for collection of civil debt are immeasurably worse for those who owe than are those in England and Wales. So do you really think there's a likelihood of difference not being pursued in many areas?
No, I mean, I didn't think, I mean, I'd agree with what you said. I didn't express myself perhaps clearly enough. What I meant was, and it goes back to the sharing point. What I'm saying is that if you accept a UK-wide structure, there may well be areas where you want to have a similar approach, like you want the same VAT, same broadly similar policies on competition policy, say, things like that, where there's an element of sharing, not difference, because it's in the interests of the devolved nation as much as it is of the rest of the UK to have a similar approach. That's what I was saying. I agree with you entirely on your point that on many areas of domestic policy, obviously health, education, welfare is, if it is partly devolved, absolutely difference comes into it. I wouldn't deny that at all. I mean, we've seen that with tuition fees, elderly care, you know, how much either is sustainable over a very long term is a separate question for another evening. But I accept exactly the force of your point. What I'm saying is that insofar as it's broadened out, actually you might get to sharing where actually the devolved body may not have more power in the area, but it cooperates with the centre more. And that's what what lied behind that. I don't disagree with you at all. There has been an element, absolutely, you know, we're offering you more in some areas rather than other areas. It also goes back to the first question, a proper audit of the trade-offs of that. Because, you know, there are areas where Scotland, you know, has gone back since 1999 as a conscious political choice of putting money into elderly care, which is going to get a lot more expensive, and into the tuition fees. And that's a deliberate decision. Well, I'm a strong believer that's up to the politicians and the electorates that are concerned, but there's a minus side too.
Microphone here.
I'm James Joyner from the actuarial profession. Thank you for a very fascinating lecture. You mentioned House of Lords reform briefly. I wondered if elected House of Lords would potentially answer the West Lothian question, or would it actually create a new West Lothian question for a second House?
I think, talking of patience, anyone who believes in that's going to be resolved quickly is certainly being, to use the last questioner's word, sanguine. That it's been battered around. I mean, one of the ideas was that, you know, if there's a yes vote, or even if you could have the House of Lords would be like the Bundesrat. It would be. I think we're a hell of a long way from that. A hell of a long way. I mean, lots more's got to happen before that happens at all. And I just think, I mean, for any government, it's a low priority. Patronage beats rationality, I'm afraid.
That could be a watchword for a lot of conversations in this
Yeah.
room.
Muir Dickey of the Financial Times. I wonder if I might ask a rather broad question about how big a change in the UK's constitutional settlement you see coming out of this referendum. Are we more likely to see a kind of bare minimum response that solves the immediate problem until the next crisis? Or do you think that the hopes of some here that we're actually going to see a real kind of a rethink of the UK's fundamentals? And connected to that, what do you think of the prospects that we'll end up with something that creates a UK in which Scotland is happy to stay in indefinitely?
I don't think it'd be happy. You may get a long period of lower tension and people getting on with it and abiding. And I mean, if you look at Quebec, where they've had occasional referendums and it's always there, but there's a sense of coexistence. Akash, who's sitting in front of you, and I met the Minister for Sovereigntist and Separation Affairs in the Quebec government. I think you were there. Wonderful title. I mean, it obviously sounds much better in French, even in Quebec French. But, you know, he was accepting there was no possibility of separation. He was Minister of Sovereigntist and Separatist Affairs. There's no possibility of separation, but they were carrying on in that way. On your earlier point, will it be the Big Bang? This is where the Constitutional Convention people think there'll be a wonderful Big Bang. Lots of people will sit around. They have a wonderful view, like Philadelphia in 1787, which wasn't a world of Twitter or the internet. even with people like, as bright as they had there. But because they were all locked up, effectively, and it helped. It was a hot summer without air conditioning. Did get some conclusions. But the idea that you could suddenly detach the process won't happen. I think it would be incremental, piecemeal. We'll see things happen in England, probably rather messy on city regions, giving more power. But it's not going to be more than that. They may strengthen the frameworks for intergovernmental links rather than the rather formalistic ones which emerged from the combination of the Good Friday Agreement and Scottish devolution. The two being mixed together, really. We may have a bit of that, but I don't see an enormous big bang, no.
Comments there?
Hi there, David Graves, freelance journalist. I was just wondering, my understanding is that the Scottish Government unsuccessfully pushed in the 2012 Act to get powers over issuing bonds. And I was just wondering if you could maybe say a few words about where you see the future devolution of borrowing powers going, and perhaps some of the risks and advantages associated with that.
I can't really say I know much about that. That is, the borrowing powers is an issue in the 2012 Act, and of course that got tied up with the currency thing of borrowing. Again, it's one where, and I'm sure John Swinney is very aware of that, you've got to prove yourself to the bond markets and where you borrow, and I don't think it's going to make a massive difference because you've got to get good credit ratings and good credit opportunities. But I'm not really an expert on that at all, so I don't want to give you an answer on an area which I don't really know much about.
In this audience, I'd have expected a forest of hands on that one, and I've seen one, a previous speaker, but have a go if it's on that point.
I have a memory, and if I'm wrong, please everyone forgive me. I think that within the Scotland 2012 Act, the Scottish Parliament can borrow up to £2.5 billion, is the figure that comes to my mind. And I'm presuming it's the equivalent of railway bonds, so to speak. So it will be guaranteed by the UK government, but there will be a small premium on top, is my working case. Now, of course, £2.5 billion is, I think the education budget for Scotland is about £4 billion, so it's not an insignificant amount of money, but as you say, would not make a material difference unless you add sort of an extra naught to it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it would be impossible to the Scottish government to become like Iceland. Despite the, under the current powers. And indeed, I think one of the interesting issues would be you'd have to have a very good fiscal record to convince people on borrowing.
Well, that brings us back round a full circle to the 2012 Act, and perhaps that's the moment for me to, for my part, thank you all, and to thank Peter, and to hand back to Ray.
Good. Can I just thank you all for coming, and on your behalf, thank Peter and Muir, and invite you all to have a drink in the foyer and continue the discussion there. So thank you very much indeed.
I